Good morning, and thank you for coming to hear about my journey moving from test cases to context-driven testing in a startup environment. I've been in software testing for about 12 years now, and I did not start in software testing. I came from a culinary arts and hospitality management background. So that's what I got my degree in. I have no formal training at the time in computer science or testing, but I did take a few courses here and there, Unix, Java programming, and those things piqued my interest, such that when I went into a career in the hospitality industry, I found that it didn't really suit me. And so I started looking for new options, found a job in a tech support role, and that led to the discovery of software testing, which I then knew as QA. So I made a lateral move at that company into a software testing position, and I haven't left since. Today, I'm the director of software testing and release at Boku. Boku is a mobile payments startup based out of San Francisco. We've actually moved a little bit beyond the startup phase, but what we do is we enable merchants to sell things to customers who can't or don't want to pay online using a credit card. So by entering your mobile phone number, you can make a purchase and have that deducted from your cell phone bill. It's sort of like what has been done with the convenience of using your email address for payments. We've done that with the mobile phone number. So today I'm going to walk you through a journey over these past 12 years, but one that's concentrated most over the last few, of how I've been able to move away from test cases and into a more context-driven, heuristic-based strategy. And hopefully you'll be embarking on a journey of your own, and some of this advice maybe you can use to apply to your own context. But before I get into the meat of my journey, I want to tell you a little bit about how I started. So my first introduction to context-driven testing was my intent wasn't to learn context-driven testing, but I had found a book that was being talked about online called Lessons Learned in Software Testing. It's written by Kainer, Bach, and Petticord. This remains my most favorite book on software testing and one that I've shared with many of the people who work with me. And I remember going through that book and marking many of the pages of lessons that I nodded in agreement with, and I thought, yes, this makes sense, this is how software testing should be done. But at the time, that's not what I was doing. So I made many bookmarks and put that book aside, and hopefully I would come back to it later when I was ready to implement some of them. And I realized at the time that I didn't really have the confidence to go and apply these things. They made sense, but I didn't really get them. And so I didn't implement them. And I needed to continue a journey growing my confidence, continuing to learn. And so the next step from reading that book was to get involved in the test community through Twitter and the various blogs. So I joined Twitter. You saw on the home screen my handle is 1030 omelet. That's based on when I was back in the culinary arts. And I wasn't talking about testing. But I was talking about the weather and the restaurants that I was eating at, and I wasn't really engaging in testing, but I started to follow people who I found out in the test community. And I found them through community websites like Software Testing Club, Ministry of Test, and I started to curate my own blog feed. Or rather blog role. And the people who were talking about things that seemed interesting to me, I started to follow them and to develop a community of people by which I can grab experience from. After that, I was working at this particular company, and they were downsizing, and people were losing their jobs, and the product was put into maintenance mode. And I had quite a bit of tenure at the company, so I was lucky enough to be part of the last few who were remaining. In fact, from a company of 200 and something, I was down to the last 5. And another company in another part of the state had purchased us and begun to kind of transfer operations over to their office. So we were there to keep the website running. But we weren't doing any software development, we weren't changing the product in any way, and so I had no testing to perform. I was also working at home and had a lot of time on my hands. But I didn't try out context-driven testing. It didn't make sense to go implement these things if we weren't doing any development of our product, and who was going to benefit from a change in software testing? Certainly not the company. They were in maintenance mode. So I didn't take advantage of that opportunity, but while preparing my talk, I was retrospecting on that and thought, what a missed opportunity that was. A no pressure, no risk environment was waiting for me to practice something that I really wanted to do. But I didn't take advantage of it because I didn't think that there would be any value to it. And I wasn't thinking about value to me, I was thinking about value to my employer. So there goes a missed opportunity. Shortly after that, the reduction in force hit me, and the team went from 5 to 4. And so I was let go, and it was time to look for a new opportunity. And thanks to some networking that I had done over the years, somebody heard I was looking for a job and suggested that I come apply to the company where they were hiring a QA engineer. And so that's when I joined Boku. I came on board as the senior QA engineer, and it was just me. So when I joined the new company, of course, I thought, what can I do here? Is this a place where I can implement or practice some context-driven testing? You're about to find out. So back in the early days of this organization, we were a startup, and there was no testers. Testing was important but not urgent. Development was important and urgent. Without a solid product, what would we test? So they didn't have any testers at the time. But a really mindful engineer took ownership over testing and began to develop test harnesses and simulators that we can use to test our various payments APIs. And that was actually a really helpful thing to get going. It helped speed testing up. Anyone who's tested APIs may know, to chain together a flow of API calls, some scripts or something to harness that would be very helpful. And in addition to those simulators, he also developed some stability and capability tests in JMeter. But these were sort of like smoke tests. There was really no solid kind of suite of tests that were being performed. But this is what got them by, and it was good enough for the time. But as the product was developing and growing, more features were being implemented, the need to bring on a dedicated tester was pretty clear. And so the company hired a QA manager. So that manager came on board, and he looked at the testing program, and he asked himself, how do we test our products? There was no documentation. We had the simulators and the JMeter scripts, but how is the new person going to know how to do the testing? So his first job was to begin some test documentation. And probably like many of us, including myself, that started by writing test plans in a Word document. So he gathered all the information he could about how the products would be tested, put those into test plans, and as time went on, the company started looking at its future and said, we're growing, we probably want to bring on some more testers, and that might be in a distributed global fashion. So how are we going to work together to execute these tests if they're all written in Word documents? So a test case management tool was purchased and brought on board, and those test plans were converted into test cases. And that's when the first regression suite was born. And so that regression suite was used every iteration to test the same test cases and hopefully find bugs. And they did find bugs. But those test cases tended to get a bit stale. They weren't always kept up to date as the product changed, but the team did the best that they could. Now, we were doing a bit of a Waterfall Agile kind of a model there. Water fragile, whatever you want to call it. It was our own flavor. Eggshell Agile, And we did 2 weeks of feature development. So developers focused on writing all of their code during a 2-week period. And at the end of those 2 weeks, the code was thrown over the wall into the QA team. And we had 2 weeks to do testing. One of those weeks was to do the feature testing, and one of those weeks was for regression testing. Now, we didn't have enough testers. There was just that one QA manager at the time to get all of that done, so he had to recruit help from the engineering team. So when the engineering team was done with their their feature development, he would pass out the tickets from our sprint backlog and say, I need you to test this and you to test this. And nobody would test their own code, but they'd test each other's code. And the QA manager would do as much as he could. And then when that week was over, it was time to do regression testing. And we had 5 days to do it. But at the end of that, we would release the software to production on that 5th week. So we had a 4-week cycle, and we thought we were agile, but it was really quite a waterfall. Now that QA manager decided it was time for him to move on for whatever reasons, and so that's when I came on board. And my first year as the senior QA engineer was to learn what the program was, adapt to it so that I can do what was done before me. So the old classic, this is the way it's been done, so come in and pick that up and follow along with that. And so that's what I did. But I found that it was really difficult to maintain those test cases and increase them because I couldn't scale my testing up. I was a single person. If I wanted to do more testing, I needed to farm out more of it to the engineers. To do more regression testing, I would need to farm out more to the engineers, and to do more feature testing, I'd have to reduce the regression cycle. But nobody wants the new guy to come in and start suggesting all of these changes. That's usually the kind of attitude. So I didn't really make any suggestions at first. I just learned the job and did it. But the company kept growing, and they said, you can bring on 2 more testers. And so we did, and I passed the torch over to them and said, you guys are now in charge of doing what I did, and I'll be a little bit more strategic and kind of oversee things. And so that was really successful. We were able to do more testing, and we were also doing more development. We were growing, and we found that the business needed to slip in more last-minute features after that code cutoff. So we started having a lot of last-minute changes into our sprint backlog, and that caused a lot of context shifting, both for the development team and for the testing team. So we were getting interrupted, having to do patch releases because we had really important business needs to go solve. And so this is when things started to kind of be a little bit frustrating, and maybe this was the first time that a need for change was visible. But I didn't make any changes just yet. I carried on into my 2nd year. And in that 2nd year, I focused a lot on skill development of the testers that I had just brought on. And so I had been exposed to some really interesting resources, both through Twitter and through blogs. And so I thought I would bring these into the workplace and teach the testers that I'd brought on about them. So that included things like James Bach's heuristic test strategy model. And that heuristic test strategy model describes a way of approaching testing that uses heuristics. And some of those heuristics mentioned there would be SF Depot, which is a heuristic for covering different elements of a product. It also mentioned Kruspik Stimple, which is a heuristic for quality criteria. And I'd also learned about another heuristic through Michael Bolton called Few Hiccups, which is a consistency heuristic. And these made enough sense to me that I can go introduce them to other people, and so we brought them on board into training, and I would teach our testers about them, and they thought it was really interesting, but we weren't quite sure how we were going to go apply them to the products that we built. How can you apply SF Depot to a financial software? We were processing financial transactions. We were focused on test cases, and so, but these were really interesting concepts. And another one that was really interesting was Elizabeth Hendrickson's test heuristics cheat sheet. So even though we didn't really begin to do a lot of changes, these kind of set down a foundation that would help us move testing forward in the years to come. Now, again, the company was growing. We needed less engineers to help us with the feature testing. And so one of the changes that I was able to implement during my 2nd year was to eliminate 1 week out of our sprint cycle. I relinquished an entire week of testing. I gave it up. I said, you can have your 5 days of regression testing back and go do something else with it, because we can actually combine our feature testing and our regression testing during 1 week, and we can get it all done. And how did I know that? Because we were having so many interruptions with all these last-minute changes that I was determined to find a way that we can stop this context shifting. And so I encouraged the team to begin their regression testing in parallel with the feature development. That might sound a bit at odds, but we found areas that we could test for regressions that weren't being affected by the changes of that sprint. And so we began overlapping our feature testing with our regression testing such that I could say with confidence, you can have those 5 days back. So the company took the 5 days back, and we lowered our iteration from 4 weeks to 3 weeks. And we were now releasing software faster, 1 week earlier. And that was really a great win for the business. It also reduced the context shifting that was happening. So at its peak, I believe we took on about 34 last-minute changes during those 2 weeks after code cutoff. And that was the motivation to change. And it worked out really well. So we successfully removed that 1 week, and we continued marching forward on this new 3-week cycle. And also in that year, I had learned about the CAST conference. And I wasn't able to go, but I was, having been a Twitter user, I was able to experience that conference through Twitter. And it really invigorated me to come out and join the conference, and so I made it a point that I would come in the next year. But there was just a lot of amazing things being said about the talks that were taking place, and I knew I had to come join. During my third year, we found that the business still needed to make changes, so patch releases, bug fixes, emergency business needs. We're working with a lot of important clients, and they had schedules, and our release schedule didn't quite work with that. And so we instituted a more formal release schedule. So we had one major release plus all these patches. So we made a formal major release and 2 minor releases. And so hopefully there would be less context shifting because it would be expected. So we actually would have 2 weeks of feature development focused on the major sprint, and when an important bug came up, it could be a candidate for the patch release. And so we worked in that fashion for quite some time, and it was helping the business to deliver software faster, but the context shifting was still there. And so maybe this didn't feel like the ideal solution, but it was good enough for now. Now, I continued reading blogs, articles, and tweets, and that's how I landed on Karen Johnson's article about a heuristic for regression testing. You might not have seen it if you weren't paying very close attention to the slides earlier, but it did come up on that very fast retrospective of her career. So when I saw her post on this heuristic, it said, here's a new way to think about testing for regressions. So instead of going to all your test cases that you continue to run through every iteration, think about 6 dimensions. And these dimensions will give you questions to ask about what testing you might want to perform. And those dimensions are recent, core, risks, chronic, repaired, and configuration. So under these dimensions, we would think about what has changed in the product recently. What are the core items of our platform? What is the bread and butter that is the bloodline? We should be testing the recent changes. We should be testing the core aspects. What about risks? I'd never thought about risks. What risk? Whose risks? But these gave us thought on exploring the different risks that could be affecting our project. And what's keeping up the product manager awake at night? What's bothering the CEO? People are experiencing risks all the time, but we had never considered them as a factor in designing a regression test. And then we had chronic. That was the bugs that kept coming up over and over and over again. We never really thought about that. And also to look at the things that have been repaired, what bugs have been fixed. Maybe one of the principles of testing is that bugs cluster. And so if you've got a bug fixed in one area, maybe we need to explore that area a little bit more deeply to see if there are any other bugs or if that change had caused another bug. And then configuration sensitive. That was one that I had never thought of when designing regression tests. What aspects of the product or platform are sensitive to configuration changes? That might be a memory change in your minimum or maximum Java heap size, or it could be any sort of configuration, thread pool size, it goes on. And so when I saw this, I thought, I get this. This makes a lot of sense. And for the first time, I saw how I can implement a heuristic at work. So I printed out my own version of a mind map based on what I had seen on Karen Johnson's blog. I printed it out and brought it into work. And as I usually did, I had a morning coffee talk with my boss. My boss at the time was that very engineer who had driven testing before there was ever a testing team. He's the one that wrote the simulators and the JMeter tests. And so I knew I was talking to somebody who got the challenges of testing at our organization. And if anybody was going to say that this could work, it was going to be him. So we looked over the heuristic. I told him a little bit about it and how I thought that this could help improve testing at our company. And he said, "This is exactly how I think about testing." It's very, it comes across as a very intellectual approach. And he said, so if this is supposed to help us do better testing, how is the regression suite that we're using today helping us? And I looked into that and I said, well, it's not. We haven't found a bug in 6 iterations. We never took notice of that. Nobody was paying attention to the fact that we were 100% passing on all of our tests. I didn't even notice that. Maybe because I didn't really care about metrics. But as done before me, I published the same metrics from that test case management tool, and we sent it out by email. And I know a few people read that, and so when we, in the past, had exceptions, they would ask about them. But things kind of stabilized in terms of our tests not failing, and the conversations about our regression suite had stopped. So he said, let's give it a try. So between the two of us, right in that room, we decided to do an A/B experiment. So we weren't going to just drop what we were doing, we were going to experiment side by side. So what we did is we executed our regression suite in parallel to using the new heuristic. And what we found was that, as expected, the test cases suite all passed. But when we were exploring away from a script and considering all those 6 dimensions, we started finding problems. And so that alone told us that there was value in moving away from what we had always been doing. And so, again, there in that room, between the two of us, we decided to drop the test case suite and implement a heuristic-based regression strategy. We didn't ask for permission. We didn't publicize it very widely. We just did it. And it was okay. The context of where I worked, again, the conversation about regression was not a really focused one. It maybe wasn't even happening. So we were able to go make a change and kind of quietly introduce it. So we had our new regression strategy in place, and we were going to need a way of asking questions about these 6 dimensions on a recurring basis. So what we did is we started to examine our sprint backlog, our bug reports. We would interview developers and product owners so that we can get a sense of what was going on in the platform. What have they been changing? What code did you write at 2 a.m.? What's keeping you awake? What third-party modules have you incorporated into the code? All of these things could be sources of risks. They could also be sources of changes and can help me focus testing in the areas that really needed it. Because the problem with the regression test cases is they were testing things that weren't changing. And they also weren't being changed as the product changed, so they were no longer helping us identify problems. But we were going to find these problems by looking at the bug reports and the changes that we were making. Now, we were also sending out those metrics in the past, and I had a feeling that maybe people weren't interested in them. Again, the conversation seemed to drop. And so how was I going to get people interested in our regression data again? How should I share our results? 100% passing isn't going to work anymore. We didn't have test cases, so I can't give you a count. I can't tell you a percentage. And so one of the concepts that I had remembered reading in the Lessons Learned in Software Testing book was the notion of a low-tech testing dashboard, also from James Bach. And this dashboard, which I'll show you in a second, is more of a visual approach to showing what's being done with our regression testing. So we decided that we would use that dashboard to broadcast our intentions and our results. This is what it looked like on the first attempt. So this looks pretty much a lot like James's examples that was included in the book. You can also find the same example online. All the references from my talk today are available on my website, and hopefully you wrote down the link from the home page of my slide. We'll put that up again. And so what we did here is we have a list of areas that we wanted to cover. Now these aren't test cases, these are coverage areas. And these are real application names from the company I work at. And so what we did is we assembled a list of our applications. We've got a lot of them. We're a service-oriented architecture. And so we put down a list of all of our apps. And we decided what level of coverage we were going to put into testing at that moment. So per James's example, the effort would be something like none, low, or high. And that would be maybe a factor of how much time you might put in, how much energy are you going to invest in testing that area. And the coverage was another factor of that. And the quality assessment was not, pass or fail. He was using happy faces, smiley faces, and neutral faces. So we gave that a try, just as he did. And it didn't really seem to work so well to follow his examples exactly. And his example wasn't really meant to be followed exactly. It's meant for you to apply to your own context, and so I applied it to mine. So we stopped using the smiley faces and the frowny faces, and we just implemented words like problems found, no problems found. And instead of 1, 2, 2+, those didn't really mean a lot to a lot of people. We decided to say things like common tests, corner cases, and that was more descriptive of how deeply we would test. And one thing that we realized that we were doing now that we hadn't done before was to explicitly state what we weren't going to test. So you see a lot of nones on this picture. We were not going to be testing the application messaging app. And we had come to that conclusion because the 6 dimensions of RC, 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 which we so lovingly refer to as RC cubed, so we can say it quicker, we looked at the bug reports, we looked at the sprint backlog, and nothing was going on with application messaging, so we shouldn't be focusing any of our testing on that. Something else deserves to be tested before that, and if there was any need, it should have come up in those 6 dimensions. And so this is a snippet. There was a lot more listed here. And as we did the testing, we also wrote down comments. I've left the comment field off because that contains, personal information from the company. But that's where we wrote down things like, I need to revisit this area, or that transaction in Japan seemed a little weird. We should go look at that again. So this is what we used to show the product owners and the development team what we were doing with regression testing. And they were actually kind of excited about it. They were like, wow, this is neat. This is actually a really helpful way to demonstrate what you're testing, and now we kind of get a little bit more about why you're testing it. And that was really good. That was helping to elevate testing. But this wasn't going to be the end of the journey. It was actually the very beginning. So what was I going to do next? I felt that with the success of implementing a new regression strategy, why not go for the whole thing? Let's implement a full context-driven heuristic test strategy at work. Why not go for the gold? How was I going to achieve that? Well, I knew that broader socialization of these ideas was necessary. We could no longer make these kind of backroom agreements between me and my boss. We needed to get broader buy-in. And so I looked at our organization. And I looked at the people who I thought would be important decision makers that could help let me know that these sorts of changes would be welcomed and supported. So the 3 people that I identified were the senior vice president of product and the director of product, so that's actually 4. This team drove the strategy of product development. They determined what products we would build, how they would function, and when they would be built. I also identified the senior VP of operations. This person was in charge of working with some of the cell phone carriers that we were binding into to enable payments. And we were binding our APIs with their APIs, and quality was certainly important to her, because any delay in launching these connections would mean a loss of new revenue for the company. And so it was important to her that we were doing good testing so that her relationships with her partners were solid and that they knew we had a good platform. I also identified the chief business officer. Now, why did I want to talk to a C-level about testing? Because I had talked to him before. So he doesn't live in San Francisco where our office is located. He's out of London. And he comes into San Francisco periodically, and one time he dropped by, and he'll pop in and sit down amongst the development team, and he'll talk about what's going on in the company, and how can you help us address some of the risks. We want, there's a lot of transparency. He wanted to know what you were working on, what you were passionate about, and so he was a really engaging person. And so we had a really nice half-an-hour chat or so about software testing and my passion for it, and how I saw the performance of testing at Boku and what I would like to be doing differently about that. And he walked away knowing that I was a very passionate person about my career. And he saw me as an asset. And so I would continue the relationship with him and go right up to the top as he was about to become the CEO. And so I was going to be talking to the head of the company about changing our testing. So I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to do that, but I knew it needed to be done. So to let them know I wanted to make some changes, I visited people in person where I could, and I said, hey, I want to take you out to lunch, and I want to talk about some changes I would like to make. And they knew some of the challenges that we were facing, and so they agreed very quickly to go out and have this discussion. And I decided I would do it in a non-professional environment. Let's go out to lunch, a little bit more casual, and that way we can get to know each other a little bit better and not have any of the distractions that exist in the office. And so that's what I had planned, and I set all those arrangements up. For the CEO, I had to email him, and having had built some rapport in the past with him, he said, sounds great, I'm coming to San Francisco in a couple weeks, book some time on my calendar, and I did. So I've now got these people kind of primed, and it's time to get ready to talk to them. So how was I going to do that? Well, the benefit of being a user on Twitter and following the AST News Twitter handle is that they publish information about what's going on in our community. And so the AST had tweeted about a video by Keith Klain where he was talking about how to talk to C-level management about testing. I watched that video, I believe, about 10 times. And just so that I really understood what he was saying. And some of the advice that I pulled out of that was, don't talk about testing. But I had already done that. And so I was just going to walk carefully with how I talked about testing in the next step. But I did. He also said that instead of talking about testing, try to align testing against the business's strategy or the risks that the business is facing. That's what the CEO wants to know. Is not about heuristics, not about test case counts. He wants to know how testing is helping the business move forward. And inevitably, they're going to want to know, what do you want me to do? And what do you want me to know? What's the point of talking to a CEO? So what action is required? So I had to think about what all those things would be before I engaged in the chats. So I did. I put quite a lot of thought into that. I attended company meetings where the CEO got up and talked about the challenges of the business, talked about the financial situation, talked about how difficult it was to scale up the engineering team, and that how we had to do more with less, meaning less money. We can't throw money at every problem. We can't hire more people to do more. We have to do this, we're still in a startup phase. So I came up with a number of things that I was going to talk about. This is how we were going to move from a startup environment to a scaling up environment. So when I had those chats, I was going to talk about how testing can support the onboarding of some really big name merchants that were on our horizon. So we're working with companies like Facebook and Sony, and we had some really big names coming ahead. How are we going to scale up our business to work with these people? They're not going to play around with low quality products. We could potentially lose business. So I wanted to talk to the CEO and the VPs about how changing testing can help bring us these new business faster. We also needed to do more frequent releases. So those 1 week major releases and then the 2 minor releases were still happening, and it wasn't the most fluid experience. There were still lots of context shifting, and so we wanted, hey, what could a goal be? Daily releases. That sounds like a great goal to move forward. It's a lofty goal, but it's one we wanted to aim for. So I was going to try to find ways in which a changing software testing can help us release faster. And I had already done that by combining our regression with our feature testing. And I figured we can do more of that as well. We were also the testing team. We were our own little group, and we didn't do a lot of collaboration with development team and product owners. And so I saw the need that in order to do better testing, and in order to follow with our regression strategy, we needed to have better collaboration with the rest of the product team. And so we were doing that with the regression testing, but we needed to do that in the other areas as well. So when we had a new product and we were going to do test planning or test strategizing, we were doing that by ourselves. We would look at the requirements and then we would work that out. And so we needed to open up our test planning and test strategizing with a broader group of people in the company. And that would lead to better collaboration, so I was going to promote that. We also were experiencing some bugs in our product where maybe the tax calculation was wrong and then we had to go make adjustments to the ledger, or we were double billing where we didn't want to double bill. And so those are bugs that can't be tolerated in a financial situation, and so how were we going to mitigate those types of bugs from happening? And how would we scale our testing up without bringing on more testers? I was told that with the 2 that you've got, you're going to have to do as much as you can with yourself and your 2 testers. And I wanted to do more, so I had to find ways of doing more with what I had. And I also mentioned that new regression strategy and how I could demonstrate that we had already undergone change, the values that brought, and hopefully that would elicit a positive response from these folks. So I had 3 lunch meetings over 3 weeks. I had some really great conversations. They listened very intently. They understood the challenges that I was talking about. They weren't secret to them. They were living those challenges. And they were also on their mind. How are we going to solve that? So I showed up with a number of possible solutions. And my solutions were to implement a heuristic-based test strategy. And so that's where I started to talk a little bit about testing. So I told them about the new strategy we had implemented, what a heuristic was, and why it was helpful. And all 4 of them emphatically gave me the green light to move ahead. And so that was a really exciting piece of news to receive, but at the same time it was quite concerning because now I had to go make good on all these promises that I had just laid down in front of them. And when you tell the CEO that I'm going to go help revenue, I'm going to help bring in those big customers, we're going to release faster, you've got to deliver on that because your credibility is on the line. And so from that point on, I needed to socialize this with the broader company, get all the product managers informed, all the engineers informed, and so everybody knew what we were doing. Now, to help me move forward with the rest of my journey, I knew that I needed to continue submersing myself in the test community. And so that's when I decided that I was going to attend my first CAST conference, which was last year. And I was already undergoing some of the changes that I wanted to change, and so the conference wasn't exactly timely for me. It introduced me to some new concepts and helped reinforce what I was doing. So I attended a number of talks, and some that really stood out for me was Fiona Charles' tutorial on the art and science of heuristics. So I spent a whole day living heuristics, and it really helped me understand what a heuristic was. You know, I thought I knew what they were, SF Depot, Kruspik Stimple, those are heuristics, but she taught us to understand what a heuristic was, and that it doesn't necessarily need to be an acronym or a mnemonic. So I walked away from that really understanding how to apply a heuristic to a real life situation. Some other talks that were really echoing back to me that I was on the right path was James Bach's keynote, which was test cases are not testing, which was to drive people towards a performance culture. And so when he was up there talking about that, I was feeling confident that I was on the right path. I'm doing the right thing, not investing everything in test cases. Another one that was actually very timely as well that I sat there nodding my head as she spoke was Alessandra Moreira's talk on the art of persuasion. You know, my boss wouldn't go for that, but I got my bosses to all of them to go for it. And I would have loved to have had her advice up front, but I didn't. But as I went to her talk anyways, and I knew that I was on the right path and I was doing the right things. And her talk was very helpful. And another one that really helped was a workshop co-led by Eric Davis and Maria Chidemo, which was about the differences between leadership and management. So it was a workshop to discover the differences between these things. And in that, I walked away knowing that I was managing, earlier I was kind of doing a combination of leading and managing change, and I had a better sense of the difference between the two. And that I couldn't be successful in just managing change, I had to lead it. And so I walked away having a better sense of what leadership was and how it differed from management. I made so many friends, had so many conversations, between the talks. And when I came back to work, I was on a high. You would have thought I had taken drugs. I was beaming. And I walked past the chairman of the board's office, and he was an early bird like I was, arriving in the office at early hours, and, hey, what's going on? I said, hey, I just came back from the software testing conference, and I had such a great time, and he saw how excited I was, and he wanted to hear about it. And so I said, he wasn't part of the socialization earlier, but I said, we're going to implement some new changes here. I'm going to rebuild our test program, and this conference is going to help me do it. I said, unfortunately, the company wasn't able to sponsor my attendance, but I was sure that I would find ways to encourage them to do so, because if I could demonstrate how resources like CAST could benefit our company, they might find a way to sponsor my attendance next time. Another thing to help me move forward was to get involved in some training. I've never gone through any formal training on software testing until I got involved in the Rapid Testing Intensive, which is an online version of the Rapid Software Testing program by James Bach. He's now renamed it. It's called the Rapid Software Testing Applied. And this is a course that you take online over a few days, and it's like a laboratory kind of environment where his rapid software testing might be more like a lecture. And so he gives you a crash course on rapid software testing and then gives you a product to apply it on. So I got my entire team to join in. Company paid for that. It was much more approachable than a conference at the time. And so the company sponsored our attendance to this training, and we learned quite a few new concepts, and were reminded about some that I had introduced to my team before. So we talked about oracles, how we know if there's a problem. We talked about heuristics, in particular his test strategy model. And he also introduced us to some new concepts that I had never seen before. How to write simple testing notes while you're doing your testing. How do you keep track of what you've done, what you've observed? You don't go write a bug report the minute you see a bug. You might want to follow a little bit deeper and see what you get before you start writing your bugs. He also introduced us to the concept of a product coverage outline, which could be an outline or a visual form of the different elements of a product. And by visualizing the elements of the product, we could discuss how we would test it. So this provided a lot of confidence to the team, and we were going to go implement it at work. I incorporated some other experiences from testers. Katrina Clokey, who's from New Zealand, is an avid blogger. She talked about experience she did creating a common approach across multiple teams. So she had a challenge where their strategy was 5 years old, the testing had diverged from it, and nobody was, didn't really reflect what was being done. And so when I looked at her article, I thought, well, I don't even have a test strategy. Maybe I should have one. And I know our testing is focused on functionality and really lacking diversity. And so I also wanted to have more visibility into our testing. So I bookmarked that and set it aside, and I found another article of hers, which was where she conducted a test strategy retrospective. So the quality of testing was varying between the people who did it because it was a cross-functional team. So testers weren't the only ones testing. That was kind of reminiscent of where I was coming from. And people were also doing testing without really knowing why. And I felt a little bit of the same thing. So I thought, maybe I want to give this a try. Luckily, I wasn't the only one. Sean Creswell, another gentleman from New Zealand, tried out Katrina's approach, and he tweeted about it. And for me, this was a light bulb moment. He had combined her advice and applied it to his own. And I saw how I can do the same. I'll explain what this is in a short second. So I went back to work, and I got the teams together, and we applied that experience. So we got some flip charts together, drew that quadrant on there, and we had got a bunch of notes and wrote down different testing that we wanted to do, and I got developers involved. What's really interesting here is, in this picture, only one person's a tester, but not everybody's pictured here. So the team was really involved. I got the team in Germany involved and the team in San Francisco. And this is what we came up with. This is our test strategy retrospective. So we have a quadrant with different things on dimensions. So we would place testing that we wanted to do. We want to do performance testing. We want to do security testing. And if we're not doing it, we'd put it on the left-hand side where it says happens never. And if we were doing it always, we'd put it on the right-hand side where it says happens always. If we wanted to do more of it, we'd move it up to the top, and if we thought we should do less of it, we'd move it down to the bottom. And if we were doing the Goldilocks amount, we'd just kind of put it right in the middle. So testers wrote down what they did on blue cards, developers wrote down what they did on kind of salmon-colored cards, and then the product manager wrote down what they did on the yellow cards. And you see quite a good mixture of orange and blue and a little bit of the yellow there. And this really showed us that developers do a lot of testing. And that was really illuminating for me. And I knew that I needed to include them further in the test discussions because they had a very significant role. Another thing I incorporated was the three Amigos concept, which I found from the Agile community. The three Amigos would be the tester, the developer, and the product owner, or the business analyst. That provided a forum for questions to be asked for our testers, who were not as comfortable asking questions in design review meetings or technical discussions. They didn't want to hijack the meeting and turn it into a testing conversation and maybe feel a little bit inadequate because they didn't understand the technical conversations that were happening. So they tried to ask their questions later. But the three Amigos provided them an ideal forum by which questions could be asked without feeling embarrassed, without feeling shy, and it actually gave them kind of a platform to have a much deeper discussion about the role of testing. We were soliciting advice from the product owner. They were actually contributing to the conversation much more than they had in the past. And it also elevated the programmer's testing, so we got to know what the programmer was doing a little bit more deeply. Talk to us about, give me some advice about where I should focus my testing. You're about to go build this product. Help me understand how you're going to build it. What tools and technology are you going to incorporate? I might want to know that as a tester so that I can explore the risks that might come behind that. Now, this Three Amigos model was so successful for us that it elevated collaboration on the team, and we've identified this as a model for how we want all of our project teams, all of our Scrum teams to function. And it's really elevated testing and the visibility of the testers on the team. So here I am now. I've gone on a 3-year journey, making significant amounts of change. And some of the things that my journey has helped my organization realize is weekly releases. We now release software once a week. We have a 1-week iteration. We have overlapped software development and testing during the same week. And it's working. We deliver software every Monday to our production environment. But we're not done. We still have those daily releases in mind, and so we need to think about how we can move towards daily releases. Can testing play a role in that? I'll be finding that out. My testing team has also really elevated their skill sets and their comfort level with being software testers. And that's been a really great thing for the team. It's brought in a lot of confidence. It's encouraged them to grow themselves professionally and to not just stick with kind of the way it's always been done, test plans and test cases. And the collaboration has improved so greatly that we can let the teams run on autopilot a little bit more than we used to. So I don't have to get involved as much as I used to in helping the team develop their test strategy, because the tools and resources that I brought in help them do that for themselves. We were also improving the quality of our products. Risks were getting addressed, and as a result, we were shipping fewer bugs to production. So we were able to demonstrate that by throwing out a method that wasn't working, and applying one that helped in a better way, we could improve many aspects of our work organization, from the culture to the product and to assist in revenue. So as I finish my 3-year journey, it's going to turn over into a 4th year, and I'm not sure what will be happening there, but speaking to you and sharing my journey is a big part of that. And so I want to share with you some closing thoughts of experience and tips that helped me, and in hopes that if you're going to embark on your own journey, some of this might help you. So don't wait for an invitation to change, because it's not going to arrive. You need to, as my mom say, dress for the job you want, not for the job you have. And it doesn't necessarily mean attire, although she meant that at the time. If you want to be promoted, you should show up in slacks and a shirt and a tie, but appropriate for the job that you have. But if you want to come in your pajamas and your raggedy old t-shirt, then nobody's going to look at you as candidate for management or promotion or, that lead job. And the reason I'm giving you that advice is because if you want change, you need to be that change. And so no one's going to invite you, so you're the one that needs to make that happen. And you're all subject matter experts, and you're the best people to do it. Changing incrementally is an ideal way to implement change. You don't need a grand plan. I didn't. I identified one thing to change, and I changed it. And then I identified another thing to change. And all I had to do was question what I was doing. Why aren't these test cases failing? Maybe they need to change. And by questioning something that really wasn't bringing a lot of value, I was able to find incremental things that I can go modify. A single change is also a great way to kind of test the waters. You don't know if your company is going to support change, so find one small thing, dip your toes in, and see how the water feels. You should also have credit in the bank. And what I mean by that is a lot like what Karen had said just before. Don't go and network when you're unemployed. It's too late. Don't go ask for support when you want change, because it's also too late. You need to build rapport, or you should build rapport, with people who matter in your organization. And you can do that by demonstrating your passion. Show them that you enjoy software testing, you care about it, and what you're thinking about the testing that's being done at your company and how you can help move it forward. And when you have had those relationships established and people have some background on who you are, they're more likely to support your change. Passion really helped me in my journey. I exhibit a lot of it at work, and it's no secret, and it was really what encouraged people to embrace the changes I wanted to employ. So find ways of demonstrating your passion. That might be through a brown bag demo at lunch, where you introduce some new testing program that you've implemented. You also want to keep tabs on the community because that's where I drew a tremendous amount of experiences and support from. Even preparing for my talk here today, the community was giving me all kinds of encouragement to get up here and talk. And I appreciate that because they're the ones that gave me the content by which I changed. That's where I found RC cubed. That's where I found the heuristic test strategy model. That's where I found 3 Amigos. And lastly, use change to solicit company-sponsored training. If you can demonstrate that a new set of training or a new type of knowledge can help improve your testing, a company might be more willing to find a way to sponsor that. And my company did. They saw the changes that I was employing and they wanted to support me to continue to do that. And so it was a no-brainer when they sponsored 2 of us to come to CAST. So find ways of how you can get your company to help grow you professionally and to help grow testing at your organization. I'm still on my journey, and I'm hoping that someone will come join me because I'm hiring. So if you know anybody who's looking for a job in software testing out in San Francisco, I'd like to get to know that person or chat to you in between the talks because we're looking for good people to come join our team. Context-driven testing is not a requirement. We're happy to use our experiences to help grow new testers into the context-driven world. And we're no experts, but we're on a journey, and the more people to join us, the better that we can be. And if you have any engage with me in any way online, I'm on Twitter, I've got email, of course, and I blog occasionally at softwaretestkitchen.com. Thank you.
All right, we're at open season. Thank you, Gary. That was great. All right, does anyone have some green cards? I have a 188 and a 154 and 192 and 57. Kristen, have you got all those? 57. 108, right? First card? Where were you? And a 23. Okay. Who's? Oh, 188. All right. Are you ready? Why don't you stand on up here?
Hi, so I was just curious about, in regards to applying the heuristic testing strategy model towards, say, automated testing. So in our company right now, we're a small team right now, and I'm kind of in charge of making the automated testing suite for regression. So I was wondering if we could apply that same heuristics to the regression suite for automation. And what's your thoughts about that as far as, targeting more specific areas rather than just running a full suite of all these test cases to go through. And again, it takes somewhat of bandwidth to do, not necessarily like manpower, but then also like, CPU resources and whatnot. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about it.
Well, my thoughts on that would be based on things that I've learned through the peer community. That I think heuristics can help you in your automated tests, but you can't necessarily take the same tests that you perform outside of automation and apply them to a script. One of the interesting concepts that I think is helpful to understand is the difference between testing and checking. So checking is more of a confirmatory validation. Testing is an exploration for problems. I don't know how to tell a computer to look for a bug. If we did, that'd probably be called artificial intelligence, and manual testing would probably no longer exist. And so testing and checking are 2 very different concepts, and automation lends itself more towards checking. So something that can be confirmed, like a Boolean result. If you expect the screen to be blue, you can check that it's blue. But if you don't know how to define the problem, you can't write a script for that. So I think exploring testing and checking will help you better understand what tests lend themselves towards automation and what tests lend themselves towards human involvement. Now, I didn't necessarily drive automation based on my experiences with heuristics. Automation is something we've been a little bit late on, and so I can't speak from my own experiences of driving automation using these heuristics, but I see that's on my horizon, and talk with me in a year and maybe I'll have a better answer.
Okay. Oh, 154, please.
Hey, Gary. I actually took RTI in the middle of 2014, so possibly we were in the same
maybe
class.
we were in the same one, yeah.
July, I think. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the details of how you actually performed the execution. It looked like you went from a list of test cases to a list of test areas, to kind of oversimplify it. Since you didn't seem to be actually executing test cases anymore, how are you actually testing those areas? Were you doing session-based testing, or can you talk a little bit more about the details of that?
Sure. We essentially put the test cases aside and we didn't convert them into coverage areas. We basically put them aside and started fresh. So on that dashboard, the low-tech dashboard, the majority of things listed there were applications, and those applications were fairly simple. Again, we had a service-oriented architecture, so applications performed a very specific task. But where we had more complicated apps, we broke them down by features. So if we had a user interface, we might have broken that down by some subcategories, and so that provided more granular details about the coverage that we were going to perform. But when we were doing our testing, we did experiment a little bit with exploratory testing and session-based test management, but we didn't actually apply that towards our regression. We again looked at our bug reports and our sprint backlog, and from that we drew what we would be testing. Did that answer your question?
And same thread.
I think you kind of covered most of it. I'm just wasn't sure what your actual, I guess, day-to-day test strategy and test artifacts were. Did you actually have? I understand where you got your test notions from of the features and so on, but when a given tester goes into work and sees what he's going to work on a particular day, and what artifacts and results are going to be delivered at the end of that day that are going to feed back into that low-tech dashboard.
Okay.
I guess that's what I'm asking about.
So when we show up at the beginning of an iteration, we have a backlog of tickets that we're going to work on, and the tester explores those tickets, sits in the planning meeting, understands what the objectives of the sprint are, and then they go back and they do a little bit of test planning. And sometimes we might write a test plan. Sometimes we might just jot down some really simple things that we want to cover on a wiki page. And depending on the complexity of the project, we might go on a full-blown out test plan, or we might even make a test dashboard specific to the work that we're doing. So if we're launching a new product, we would apply that low-tech dashboard to the product that we were developing that week. So we didn't apply it only to regression testing. But we really relied on the domain knowledge of our testers. And so they were very familiar with the test cases that we were using in the past, and they drew upon their domain knowledge to help them see what testing that they would perform. And again, we used the collaboration with the development team and the product owners to help us understand what areas we needed to do our testing on. So the types of artifacts that we were producing varied depending on what the project was. Some had test plans, some didn't. Sometimes a developer would leave us a few notes of what their advice was to us on how we would test that particular change. We use a ticketing system or issue management system to track all of the work that we're doing. And so when work was done, it would be marked functionally complete. That would signify it's ready for a tester to pick that up. And if it was a really simple change, then we'd read the testing advice from the developer. So a lot of it was just very ad hoc, light documentation, and we've committed more of our resources to performing testing rather than documenting testing.
36.
Oh, I'm coming.
Sorry. Just to help on that same thread, rather than what your testers were doing on a daily basis, rather than following test cases, weren't they doing more exploratory testing, where they would, you would have a certain area that you felt was a risky area, and they wouldn't be following a script. They would be using their knowledge of the risks and meeting with the developers, go out and try to find bugs. So it was less scripted. And I think maybe you were asking about what kind of testing they were doing. I don't know if that helps.
We were probably doing exploratory testing, but maybe we weren't conscious of it at the time and explicitly saying we are doing ET. But as I said earlier, we had experimented a little bit about it, and one book that assisted us with learning exploratory testing was a book called Explore It. That was published in 2013 by Elizabeth Hendrickson, and that book gave us a really great foundation to understand the elements of exploratory testing. And so having gone through that book and done a little bit of practicing, we probably drew those skills in without even realizing it, and that's something that's on the horizon for us to try to implement more formally. With growing the test team, we can now implement, we now have time to do exploratory testing, and before things were very tightly structured, with 1 week releases, we don't always have time to go do that kind of exploration, but it's certainly on the list, and we were probably doing it.
We have a question in from the tweet printer, and since you were just referencing a book, I think it's kind of relevant to mention it. Do you have any resources where you organized your current CDT knowledge and resources?
I don't. I mainly gather resources on my browser bookmarks, and I synchronize my browser bookmarks between my work computer and my home computer so that I always have access to things that I've seen online no matter where I am. So when I saw Karen Johnson's article, I bookmarked that, and then I have it there for when I want to access it. And there's tons of articles that I've read that I've never done anything with, but they're sitting there waiting for me to engage with them. It'd probably behoove me to share many of the resources online, but having not really experimented with a lot of them, I haven't done so. But the resources that helped my journey over these last couple years, you can find a reference list on my blog at the address shown on the screen.
Okay, great.
Okay, new threads, we have 192, 57, and then 23.
All right, 192.
Thanks, Gary. Good presentation. My name's Dan. I work for a company that is very interested in audit right now. So we want to make sure that all of our requirements are covered and all of our test cases are linked to our requirements, and all of our test cases have test executions, and all of our bugs link back and so forth. Because if we don't do that, we're not covering our software properly. So I've got a confession to make in front of other employees who are standing in this room right now. I don't do that. I test, I explore, and then I go back and I do that documentation that satisfies our audit. What I would like to know is, you're talking about financial software here, so there's likely some kind of audit happening. How do you satisfy those auditors? How do you let them know that you've tested the things that you need to test?
In the organization I work at, the only auditing that I'm conscious of is at the financial level with the accounting team. So we actually we're not like a bank. We don't hold money. We're a transmitter of money. And so we're held under a different set of guidelines. Now, based on that, we don't get audited as I believe you have described under your organization. And so that's not something that we have to deal with. But so I can't speak from my own experiences about how I can satisfy the needs of an auditor while applying context-driven testing, but it sounds like you found an interesting way of doing that yourself. I know this conversation is not new to the test community, and I've heard of some people, although I can't recall their names, who have dealt with this very situation. And so you might put a call out onto Twitter to find out what some other folks' experiences have been in satisfying auditors' needs. And I believe some of them has been understand what the auditor is trying to understand. Maybe there's other ways that you can satisfy those needs by not using test cases. And they're probably sticking with, they probably want test cases because that's what they've always done. And part of what I had to do was challenge the things that we had always done. You can't say, this is the way we've always done, so let's continue to do it. It's not bringing value. But if you're under regulation to supply that, I think we have to be creative like you have, and in order to do very intellectual testing, and then you can go back and say, well, this test case was covered through this exploratory charter, and so that passed. And just because you're doing exploratory testing doesn't mean you're not covering things that were in those test cases.
Okay, same thread.
Speaking to your point, I'm one of those people that have done what you're trying to do. And the trick is to follow session-based exploratory testing to the letter. Follow the documentation, use the tools and the metrics. That will go through an auditor, and I was working on FDA-regulated medical device software, and it goes through an audit, no problem. The only feedback I've really ever gotten about it is sometimes it's too much information. It might be a little too much for the auditor, but it is possible, and it does tie into what he's saying. You just need to take a look at session-based exploratory testing as it was originally written by James and John, and that'll help a lot. The other person will be James. You can ask him questions about it too. He and I have both done medical device stuff with that, and it's passed audits. So, Ben Yark.
Okay, 139, same thread. I'm running around the room.
So yeah, kind of similar. I used to work at a medical device company, and so we had the same FDA regulations. It's a little bit different because it was we didn't have as much of the session exploratory testing. It was all scripted, do exactly this, exactly this. But we had, this might be of some adaptable use to other people. We were using Microsoft Word for our test plans, and it was very heavy in macros, that all the requirements were a specific format, and we could indicate we have this requirement covered in this test case of this test plan. This requirement is tested here. And then we had a pass-fail status for each test case. And so then we had a different macro that would go through, look through all of the test plans to make sure that every requirement in our requirements document was covered in a test plan and it passed. So it was kind of a lot of overhead for maintaining the macros and the test plans and all that, but it was an automated way that as the testers, we didn't have to worry about that documentation. It was done in the background for us. So that was a pretty intense but very effective method that we used to get that audit information without the testers having to spend all this extra time or worrying about documenting stuff. So.
Okay, great. We're running out of time. We got maybe one more question.
New thread 57.
All right.
Hi, Gary. Thank you. So when you were talking about release cycles or releasing every week, I was curious if your application has a lot of UI that's being tested, or are a lot of the changes in the background, and that's why a weekly release cycle, or even you also mentioned going to a daily release cycle would make sense. And then if not, if you could talk about whether or not your application is always available, or if you're taking it down every week and then bringing it back up, and how that works for your user base.
Sure. Well, we run a highly available, redundant platform that has a very high uptime. We're talking, 99% uptime. So we never take our site down when we do a deployment. So we might have 3 to 5 nodes of a particular application running, and then we can take one node down at a time and update it, and then we do that incrementally until all the nodes have been updated. So backwards compatibility is very important when we're developing that. And when we move to, we don't have very many UIs. The UI is not a very significant aspect of our product. We are mostly driven by APIs, and in our platform, we probably have about 300 individual, maybe about 250 individual Java applications, and they all have a very specific purpose, so they're really easy to test and get shipped out. And a lot of these things can be shipped in isolation, so they're not necessarily dependent on 5 or 6 other applications also going out with it. Now, when we have UI testing, we basically have we have a payment panel that some of our merchants can use, or they can build their own payment panel that sits on top of our API. So when we go through UI testing, we still can do weekly releases, but we batch everything up in chunks. So we work in about 90-something countries, and if we're going to do a redesign of our payment interface, we might bite off about 5 countries at a time. And so we'll go change 5 countries and ship them. And then we also might do it in an A/B testing fashion, where every other transaction gets the new UI, every other transaction gets the old one. So that's how we can make big UI changes over long periods of time, and taking small bits of risk. We only do a little bit, and the risk is much lower. And so since we're not really heavy on UIs, it's working for us.
Okay, Gary, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who came out and asked questions.
Thank you.
Yes, awesome. And there's still a couple of folks that had questions, so hunt Gary down over his lunch, and don't let him enjoy that at all. All right. Thanks, everyone.